Yesterday was the peak of the heat wave on the Central Coast. We had some triple digits inland. Even the beaches like Santa Cruz were at 97 degrees. It's been awesome beach weather the last couple of days. But with very warm temperatures comes higher fire danger. And right on time with the peak of the heat wave yesterday, we did have some wildfires popping up. It looked like mostly in Monterey County. And I wasn't too surprised when I got the alerts on my phone from Watch Duty that we had some fires out there. But then once I saw the alert, I went through some of the steps that I use when I'm forecasting wildfire. And I didn't really need to dive too far into this just because I'd been already forecasting the Central Coast all week, so I knew what the conditions were like. But I looked at Watch Duty, I looked at the details of the fire, I looked at where it was, I looked at what the smoke plume was doing. And I used all of this information to basically decide, this is probably one of those fires I don't need to go on YouTube and make a wildfire forecast about because I think they're going to have this handled in about an hour or two. So the question there would be, how did I know that? And what would be some features that I would see where I'd think, I got to get on YouTube right now, do a live stream and warn people about this fire because it could be extremely dangerous. So in this video, I'm just going to be breaking down what I do when I'm wildfire forecasting. I believe this is year 4 of me being a wildfire forecaster. I started in 2020 when I was up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I was between the CZU Lightning Complex and the SCU Lightning Complex. And I was living in a very high fire danger area at the top of a box canyon with only one road in and out and fuels that hadn't burned in decades. And some ash raining on my cabin as well. Or not my cabin, but I needed to know whether I needed to evacuate or not. So what I did was I went online and I tried to find some information, but I couldn't really find anything all that useful. It was more just like videos of flames, or it would say the acreage that had burned, but that didn't really help me too much because I didn't know which direction the fire was moving or where on the fire was the fire actively burning right now. It says 100,000 acres, but is 100,000 acres burning, or was all of that a week ago and now only 500 acres are burning? So those are the questions I had, and I figured, okay, I can't find the answers, so maybe I'll just try to look for them myself, and then maybe I'll try to communicate that information out. And it was in this process that I started to build up some of the steps and tools that I use to forecast wildfire so that I can sometimes answer those questions for myself, but then also answer those questions for other people, because I'd imagine when they're in that same situation, they're asking the same questions. So let's just go through maybe a couple hour span of where a wildfire pops up, or maybe a wildfire has already been burning for a couple of days, but it's just brought to my attention because maybe it's becoming a lot more active. They're making some evacuation orders. The first thing I would do is I would go to Watch Duty. That's a great website or nonprofit. And I would read the timeline of pretty much the entire fire. And I would specifically read what happened yesterday and then the day before as well, because that gives you, kind of sets the stage, sets the foundation for what conditions have been like on the fire. Because in order to know what the fire is going to do in the future, you have to know what it's done in the past. It's almost like when you're trying to create a vision of your own future, or you're trying to set a goal, one of the best things you can do is think about your past. What are some of your experiences? What are some of the skills that you've built up? And then use that information to guide the path forward. So very similar to wildfire forecasting, same thing with weather forecasting. First thing I do when I get into the station is I look at all the observations of the temperatures we actually picked up today, or how much rain we actually picked up today. And then that lays the foundation for what I expect is going to happen tomorrow. So first thing I do, read Watch Duty, get a good idea of what's been going on in the fire. Then I would go to either CAL FIRE or InsaWeb. Those are two great resources, and then I would click on the fire, and within there it gives you kind of the quick summary of your conditions on the fire, what's happened, what is expected to happen. Usually there's a little section that gives you the weather forecast, and then also usually they have a section that explains the forecasted fire behavior as well. So it's very useful to see that. But remember, as a forecaster, you almost want to try to just get lots of pieces of information from lots of different sources and then conglomerate them all together. You usually don't want to just go off of one source. You can say, the reason I say that is because you don't exactly know the last time those sources were updated. Like, I've had it happen in the past where I was just going off of one source and it was maybe a few hours old and conditions had completely changed. And my forecast ended up being, you could say, dangerously wrong. So then what I figured out in the future is, I have to collect a lot of different sources. Maybe I use this to build my foundation, but then as I'm actually getting up to the fire, maybe I go on Twitter, or I guess it's now called X, try to figure out what's actually happening on the ground right now, and then do some other resources that give you a good idea of the up-to-date live components of the fire. So right now, still just building the foundation of our knowledge. So Watch Duty, CAL FIRE, InsuWeb. The other thing I'll often do is usually the CAL FIRE resources or Forest Service has Facebook pages. And one of the most useful things you can do is watch their little live meetings in the morning and the evening, where they have all kinds of different specialists come on. There's one person who talks about what they're doing for containment lines and where they're putting dozers and hand crews. So kind of the fire strategy, and then they usually have what's called an IMET, which is the incident meteorologist. I believe that's what it means. And then he's giving the details on how he views the weather changing throughout the day. And then they have numerous people come on. Somebody usually talks about evacuation orders. So that is usually about a 20-minute video that gives you, again, a good idea of what's going on the fire from the people who know better than anyone what's going on the fire. And that is another thing I should emphasize. When I say, I take all these different sources, you also weight some of those sources much heavier than others. For example, I usually try to stick to exactly whatever CAL FIRE is saying. And I almost try to just take what they're saying and then maybe communicate it maybe more concisely, or if I just think, okay, what's the main thing people need to know, and then I just put that forward just to try to maybe condense the information or bring in some fire weather knowledge, some forecasting, maybe some different graphics that help tell the story. So usually I do go off of, I would say 99% of the time, usually go off of what CAL FIRE is saying. The 1% of the time where I change is if things look like they've been changing a lot since that report happened. So now we've laid our foundation. Next thing I do is usually I look at the satellite imagery, because that's always the best way to see how much smoke is actually being produced on the fire. And that's going to be live, up to date, gives you a good idea of what's actually happening out there. And at first, you're not going to know what is a large amount of smoke and what isn't. But as you see fire after fire after fire, and you see how many acres were burning that day, some of the video of the fire, you start to understand what is a lot of smoke on satellite imagery. And one thing I do always look at, if you can see little white, almost puffs in that what is usually gray smoke coming up, that's a good indication that you formed a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which is like a fire thunderstorm. That means you have a lot of convection happening. It means the column is getting very tall. And that usually means you have some pretty extreme conditions on the ground. So that is one thing that I look for on the satellite imagery. Luckily, haven't seen that too much this year. Next, so for that, I usually go to College of DuPage Weather. Great satellite imagery on their website. And then it's in the weather analysis tools. Next thing I usually do is I go to websites where you can actually see where the fire is burning. Watch Duty has now updated their website where they have this. I also use CalTopo. That's another great site. But what you can do is you see the fire perimeter, and then there's different infrared, I think you call it, or just heat imagery, I'll put it that way, where it shows where the fire has burned more recently. And if I can get my hands on Google Earth data, that's usually the best data to have. But sometimes, since they get that from flights instead of satellite imagery, that can be a bit more delayed or out of date. So I usually use that more in my foundation side, and then when I'm trying to figure out what's happening right now, I'll go to some of the heat imagery that comes from satellites. I think some of them update every 15 minutes, and it shows a kind of overview of where the fire is actually burning right now. I have to really stretch or provide a disclaimer on that, because since it's coming from satellites, I have seen that heat imagery be way off in the past. And a lot of times it won't work as well if you have a lot of smoke over the fires, because it can't get down to actually see what's burning on the ground. And sometimes it can be off by miles, and it often overestimates how much fire activity is actually happening. However, it gives you a good idea of where the fire is burning and the direction it's burning as well, because you can see the little heat images pop up, and then it updates 15 minutes later, and you maybe see them pop up a little bit farther to the north, and then you see it pop up a little bit farther to the north. And while it doesn't mean everything underneath those kind of heat spots or hot spots has burned, it gives you an idea at least of the direction the fire is moving. So from there, one thing I also do usually on CalTopo is I'll click on fire history, and I'll try to see if there's been any recent burns in the area. And I'll especially look for ones that have burned within the last 5 years, and then maybe even stretching out to the last 10 years. Because that's going to be areas where fuels have already cleared out because of the fire in the past. And that's where I would expect growth to be limited in the future, because you need fuel in order for a fire to continue to burn. And I've seen that time and time again while wildfire forecasting. Fire will just be ripping up to the north, let's say. But then I see that there was a fire that burned there 3 years ago, up to the north of there, and then the current fire will bump up right into that previous fire perimeter, or you could say the burn scar, and then it just stops in its tracks. And it almost creates this perfect puzzle piece where you have all these cool patches, or I think you could say mosaics, across the landscape. And in some cases, that's also because they created a containment line in the past for the previous fire, or some kind of fuel break, and then they're able to use that exact same fuel break for the current fire. So you get kind of a 2-for-1, 2 birds with 1 stone, 2 fires with 1 fuel break. So that's another big thing I look at, because fire history is going to significantly limit fire activity in the present. So at this point, I've kind of figured out what happened yesterday. Where is the fire? Where is it currently burning? The next, maybe most important thing to do is on CalTopo, I click on structures, and I see where are the structures on this fire, because this is going to give me a good idea of how dangerous is this fire right now. Because if it's one of those lightning fires way up in northwestern California where it's burning up to the northwest, and I look at structures and there's nothing in the entire northern edge of the fire, and that's the direction the fire is moving, maybe still do a video just because it's interesting and other people might be curious. Maybe there's people who live on the southern edge of that fire, and it's important information to know that the fire is not moving towards them. That's very important information, so they know, you can maybe get ready to evacuate just in case things rapidly change, but you can maybe reduce your fear a little bit right now. You're actually in a better position than if you just look at the acreage burned. And that is one of the key things I want to say. I do look at the acreage that's burned on a fire, but I really don't weigh that variable very highly, because you can have 700,000 acres burned on a fire, but if maybe it rained the day before and all of a sudden there's very few hotspots on the fire, there's much less danger on that fire than, let's say, some fire that's 1,200 acres, but it has grown that 1,200 acres that day, and the entire fire perimeter is actively moving towards structures. So it matters a lot more where the fire is burning and how close that fire is to life and property. So yeah, definitely look at structures, and I keep that in mind. Then the key thing I'm going to do is then get into the fire weather principles. So that's where reading this book, Fire in California's Ecosystems, I just finished the fire weather principles chapter, but it was a lot of the same stuff that I learned when I was in graduate school, earning my master's in meteorology under the Fire Weather Research Laboratory. And that's where I built up a lot of the tools that I've used for wildfire forecasting, because that's also going to be a good indication of where the fire is going to burn throughout the day today. It's what is the weather doing and how active the fire is going to be as well. So first thing I usually do is I go to usually windy.com, that's my favorite weather website, and I'll just click forward to 4 p.m. That's usually the hottest time of the day. That will typically be the peak of your fire activity. There's variation around that, but 4 p.m., it's a pretty good benchmark right there. I look at the high temperature that's expected. Let's say it's 85 degrees. I start to think to myself, ooh, that's pretty hot. I bet it's dry as well. Then I click to relative humidity and I see 9% relative humidity. Pretty much anything in the teens, especially below 17% relative humidity, is where I really start to ring my alarm bells that it may be a day where we have extreme wildfire behavior. The 17% actually comes from my master's thesis, where I identified the thresholds in all our different variables, where as you cross that threshold, extreme wildfire activity becomes much more likely. And I believe the temperature one was about 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, extreme wildfire becomes more likely. Below 17% relative humidity. Key thing I'll point out though, just because you cross a couple of thresholds doesn't mean you're going to have an active fire day. Yesterday on the Central Coast, we were in the mid to high 90s, even a couple triple digits. It was very dry air out there, but our winds were about 5 miles per hour. So wildfire activity pretty minimal, even though we did have some fires pop up. So temperature, relative humidity. Again, the reason that's important, the drier it is, the drier your fuels are going to be, especially the fine fuels that react to the atmosphere very quickly. And then if you ever started a campfire, you know that if your fuels are dry, it's easier for a fire to start, and then it's also easier for it to spread, and it just burns a lot faster and hotter. So once I have those two down, let's say, it was 85 degrees, 9% relative humidity. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take it off of 4 p.m., and I'm going to go back to the current time on Windy, and I'm going to go to wind gusts, and then I'm just going to click forward. I think it maybe goes every 3 hours. If you have the paid version, it goes every single hour, and I'm going to see how the winds are changing throughout the day today. Now, 90% of the time, your winds are going to increase with your temperature, and they're most likely going to be going up valley or up slope during those afternoon hours. So let's say I see it's going to be 28 mile per hour gusts this afternoon. And I see that the wind direction is blowing to let's just say to the northeast. It's going up the slope that we're seeing. And that ties back into the heat imagery that we looked at, where the fire was at the base of that hill. Then I could look at Google Earth to see how much vegetation looks to be on that hill. I look at fire history to see if there's been a previous fire on that hill. And then if all of those things kind of connect, I can say, okay, the fire is most likely going to go up this hill this afternoon. I would also bring in that information I got from CAL FIRE about, but did they put a fuel break at the bottom of the hill, or are they putting one on top of the ridge? And kind of just piecing together all of that different information. I should dive in a little bit more into that wind factor that I just mentioned, though, because that is one of the key things that I look for in wildfire forecasting. Is one of the most important principles. It talks about this in the chapter I just read in Fire in California's Ecosystems, but if you have a valley, during the afternoons, your hillsides or your mountain slopes are going to heat up faster than the valley below. So you're going to get rising air. And then something has to fill in that air that just left, so you get air rushing up from the valley. This is typically going to lead to your fastest fire growth of the day if you do have a fire somewhere on this hill, because the winds are going to push it uphill, and the fire already likes to go uphill because fire burns faster uphill. The flames tilt over, heat up the vegetation in front of the flames, dries them out before the fire gets there, so then the fire can move a lot faster because it's using all of its energy just to immediately combust the vegetation instead of wasting its energy evaporating some of the moisture out of the plants. So that does remind me, that's another big thing that I look at on when I'm forecasting wildfires. What is the topography doing? So fuel, weather, topography, that's the three keys to fire behavior. So I'm looking at all of those throughout this whole process. So again, back to our valley. During the afternoons, your air starts rushing up the valley. That will most likely lead to the fastest fire spread of the day, going uphill. Then at nighttime, the reverse is going to happen, where your hillsides are going to cool off faster than the valley. So you get all this cold, dense air filling or right along the ground, and then that's just going to settle down to the valley bottom, almost like you just have a dense liquid kind of sinking down and settling in the valley. So then with that air that's sinking down, you'll usually have some winds blowing down into the valley at nighttime. So your fire activity will often have what you call a diurnal pattern. It's kind of a sciencey way of saying it goes uphill during the day, downhill during night. And you just see this perfect little kind of rhythm to it. I remember seeing that perfectly on the Dixie Fire, and I believe the North Complex as well. That was something that I was just seeing every single day. Go uphill during the day, downhill in overnight. So at this point, we've got most of the fire weather information that we need. I do always keep my ears and eyes open for if there's going to be any exceptional kind of fire behavior. With that, it would be something like a downslope windstorm. That could be something like Diablo winds, Santa Ana winds, Sundowner winds. That could lead to some very hot, dry, gusty winds. A lot of times those will actually happen overnight, which is why they're often the most dangerous kind, because actually, it ties in perfectly with what I was just explaining. The reason your downslope windstorms will be strongest overnight, and a lot of times it's offshore in California, is because during the afternoon it gets canceled out a little bit by those upslope winds, whereas at nighttime it just has kind of a double whammy from also the cooling effect from the mountain leading to already winds going down the slope, and then you also have downslope windstorm. That's maybe getting a bit too into it, but that's one of the most dangerous features that we have in California. And those events typically happen more as you get into fall. You don't usually see those in summer. And that's why overall we see maybe more fires, and overall fire danger is higher in summer just because it's the hottest, driest part of the year. And fire danger decreases as you get into fall overall, but you will have brief periods of days where it's the highest fire danger of the entire year, especially if you haven't had a good rain yet. The fuels have been drying out for months, and then you get one of these offshore downslope wind events, and all of a sudden you have all of the different fire weather features at the most extreme points they've been in the entire year. So that's one of the big wild cards I look for. Another one that I look for is if you're going to have any thunderstorms popping up. Best way to put it is these are a wild card, because sometimes thunderstorms can bring rain, and it really helps out our wildfire danger if it brings enough rain to the fire. Most of the time, I'd say the rain you get from thunderstorms isn't enough to help out too much, and the thunderstorms just move very quickly. So you don't have all that rain accumulating in one place, actually bringing more moisture back into your fuels. A lot of times what thunderstorms are actually going to do is either start new fires because of lightning. It's usually up on the higher elevations, up in the mountains. That's where you have a lot of unstable air because it's lifting up the mountain. Or you're going to have gusty, erratic winds with thunderstorms. So that's where you have some winds blowing into the thunderstorm. So that's going to lead to winds coming from one direction, and then you'll almost have them blowing in an opposite direction or just erratic direction on the downdraft side of that thunderstorm. And that can lead to very erratic fire behavior that increases usually over a short period of time, but it can be pretty dangerous when that happens. Something that is similar to that, but I don't actually see happen too often, is when you have a cold front come through when there's wildfire. As the cold front's coming through, you're going to have very windy conditions, Before the cold front comes through, you'll have southerly winds. After the cold front comes through, usually your wind speed decreases, but the winds will quickly shift to the west or the northwest. That's, again, maybe getting too into the weeds. I haven't seen that too often in the 4 years that I've been forecasting, just because you don't have a lot of cold fronts during fire season. But I mention that because that is another situation that can be extremely dangerous, especially to firefighters on the ground, because of that very quick wind shift that can happen. In some cases, it could be over the course of 15 to 30 minutes, where the winds completely change the direction they're coming from. So then the fire is going to completely change the direction where it's spreading. So maybe you think you're in a safe position 1 second, cold front comes through, the fire is now going the exact opposite direction you thought it was going to be, and you're in danger. Now, the other one that I keep in mind when it comes to wildfire forecasting, because this is something that I would say a lot of my biggest mistakes in fire forecasting have come from this. And it also drives home the point that it's very important to understand what happened on the fire the day before. So let's say on the fire the day before, massive amount of smoke was produced. And then I look at the satellite imagery and I see a lot of that smoke just seems to be settled. Let's say I'm looking at it in the morning. And I look at the winds, and I actually click into some of the observation stations. National Weather Service has stations you can look at. Same with wonderground.com. You can look at the Wonder Map. And you can actually see what's the temperature right now, what are the winds right now, relative humidity right now. And in the morning, I'll see it's maybe 3 mile per hour winds. And let's say this is at the bottom of a valley, so all that cold air has been able to sink to the surface. And then all that smoke that was produced the day before has just settled down over that valley. Now, if you just go off of the model data, like windy.com, and this is something that I've had to learn through the mistakes I've made in my past, I'll see, it's going to be 85 degrees this afternoon, 9% relative humidity, and 28 mile per hour winds. This is going to be a huge fire day. So maybe I say that in my wildfire forecast in the morning. I say, we're going to see a lot of fire activity this afternoon. There was a ton yesterday. This afternoon's actually going to be even hotter, drier, and windier than yesterday, so I'm expecting even more growth than we had the day before. But then what happens is there's so much smoke that sunlight doesn't get in to heat up the mountain slopes, so that doesn't lead to any rising air. That doesn't lead to the winds going upslope. It doesn't heat up the valley bottom at all, so your temperatures end up being 70 degrees. Your relative humidity doesn't drop down. It's maybe 40%, and then your winds are 12 miles per hour. So the basic summary there is sometimes you can have so much smoke that you can almost throw out all the model weather data that didn't account for that smoke, and the forecast can be completely different. That's still something that is very difficult to forecast. It has to do with stability and inversions, and it's a very hard one that I'm still trying to figure out. So I'll keep you guys posted if I actually figure out the best way to know when that is going to happen. But it is an important one to know. And then the final one that I'll get into, because I think this is actually the number one lesson that I have learned as a wildfire forecaster, and it's to know when to question your data. And this is also important as a weather forecaster, is you don't just want to be the mouthpiece of the data that you're collecting. This is also where your own knowledge, your own experience, and your own perspective comes in. And this is where it's like a lot of what I've said so far, maybe anybody could do that, but this is where the knowledge really factors in, is knowing how to interpret that data. And maybe that's part of the reason that people still listen to people like me who are weathermen on TV, where they have all the numbers on their phone, but they want someone maybe with experience to be able to interpret all that data and just tell them a story of what's going to happen based on their knowledge of the local environment. And that's a specialty. So it's the same thing with wildfire forecasting, is we have all of these different pieces, and it seems like it's an equation, but sometimes what's actually going to happen, or what you think is going to happen, really depends on just a gut feeling based on maybe all of the knowledge that you've picked up in the past that's just buried deep in your subconscious mind. So that's maybe more of the philosophical side of things. what I'm basically saying is one of the biggest mistakes that I've had as wildfire forecaster was before I learned this lesson, where I collected all my data and it was the same as I'd done in all the previous days. And then at this time, I wasn't doing live streams. I was recording my video and then posting it. So I had all my links, my websites, what I thought was going to happen. And actually, no, I was live streaming. So I was live streaming, but I wasn't looking at my chat at all. That was what was happening. And I'm just presenting all the data that I've collected and not really thinking about it, but just kind of being the middleman between the information that I'd found and the information that I was saying. And then I've clicked the end of the live stream. I thought, okay, so because of that, we're actually in a pretty good situation. We have some fire activity, but it's not that close to any structures. And I click end, and I look at the live chat, and it's just filled with comments from people saying like I forget what city it was, but I forgot what city it was. I believe it was on the Dixie Fire, though, where people were saying, like, this city's burning down. Why isn't he talking about this? Like, the whole town is, like, evacuating right now. Like, literally flames going through the city. And that was just the entire live chat. And I thought, oh, my gosh, like, I just put people's lives at risk. Because if they were watching my live stream where I'm saying this is where the fire is based on all the information that the best information that I could find at that time. This was maybe before our tools were a bit better. And maybe I was putting forward this idea, oh, it's actually fine out there. And then that could be very dangerous because someone's watching me. They think, oh, this guy says it's fine. I'm not going to evacuate. Meanwhile, the fire just rips through the town. So actually, the first thing I will say is if you're ever in an area where there is a wildfire, if you get that gut feeling that you should leave, just get out of there. Don't wait for somebody to tell you or wait for some authority to call you to say it's time to evacuate. If you get that feeling that something's a bit dangerous, there's not much. There's some things that you can do in that short period of time to prepare your house, like maybe hose down the roof or, I don't know, maybe cut some bushes out and push them away from your house. I don't know, blow the leaves away from your house. Sorts of things like that. But if you get that gut feeling, then it's time to leave, and don't wait for any authority to tell you what to do. Then I maybe shouldn't say that, but yeah, if you get that gut feeling that you're in danger, don't hesitate to leave. So the lesson that I learned from that experience, though, because I think that was the best lesson that I have learned as a wildfire forecaster. The other one was the fact that smoke can sometimes reduce fire behavior. On that day, I had actually been the forecaster for our fire weather research team, and they had all drove like three hours to go up to this fire because I had said it was going to be active fire conditions, and then because there was so much smoke, there ended up being no fire activity at all. So that was maybe my second best lesson there. Number one lesson was what happened where I was using all the information I had, but it just wasn't good enough. And from that, I learned the lesson to always try to stay up to date and to listen to people on the ground as well. So now a lot of times in my live streams, I will have maybe an iPad up next to my computer just with the live chat open so I can see what questions are coming in or if there's some comments. A lot of time I'm using maps and numbers and model data, and a lot of the time that works. But some of the time, the people who are actually on the ground know better than you do. So it's also very helpful as a wildfire forecaster when I get feedback from other people, because I place a higher value on that, somebody actually on the ground in an area, than any other numbers or maps I can find online, especially if they're a local person who knows the environment much better than I do. It's usually the case in these videos that I make. But so reading and paying attention to the live chat. And then also, I've found that Twitter, or it's now called X, that's also the number one place I'll go to for up-to-date wildfire information. There's lots of wildfire experts on there, and sometimes I'll even have that up in my live streams. Like, I think the best live stream I've ever done, And it was from the lesson that I learned on the Dixie Fire was on the Caldor Fire. The fire was pushing up towards South Lake Tahoe, and it looked like it was going to take out South Lake Tahoe at one point. And I think I did a 7 or 8 hour live stream as it was pushing up towards South Lake Tahoe. At one point, we got evidence that the fire jumped over Christmas Valley, so then we had fires on both sides of the hill. And what I was doing was I was going on Twitter, finding like a local video. It would show this is the highway, and we'd see the flame on the left side of the highway, and then they pan the video over and we see it on the other side of the valley. So then I would go into Google Earth, I would find that actual spot in the highway where they were. Sometimes you can even get it perfectly based on different rock outcroppings or different buildings. And then I was able to figure out exactly where the fire was while the fire was actually moving, while simultaneously bringing in some of that weather information where I'm looking at stations on the ground. It shows there's a southerly wind pushing at 28 miles per hour. So I think, okay, the fire is going to keep moving towards the north. Or in this case, I think it was more southwesterly. So it was pushing the fire across Christmas Valley to the northeast. But that was the best wildfire forecasting that I've done, because I built that foundation, understood what the fire was doing, but then at a certain point you have to understand that fires are very active. They're constantly changing, and you need to stay up to date with the most recent information if you actually want to help protect life and property. So that video is definitely a lot longer than I had originally planned. I wanted to just do a 10-minute brief summary, but I got a bit excited about wildfire forecasting. It's, I'd say, arguably the number one thing that I'm passionate about. So if you guys have any tips that maybe I missed, let me know in the comments. As I said, I value everyone's insight very highly, and I'm sure there are I know there are a lot of things that I still have to learn out there, and that's part of the reason I'm slowly going to keep working my way through fire in California's ecosystem. So if you want to come along on this journey as I learn more about wildfire, you can. I'll have videos. So far, I've been doing them every day. I'm hoping to keep that going. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.